The Bank of England has raised interest rates to 0.5% in an attempt to control inflation, which now stands at 5.4%. That's the highest it's been since 1992. In April, it's expected to leap again, this time to 7.25%. According to the bank, this means that the value of a household's disposable income will suffer the largest drop since records began. This Resolution Foundation graph, based on a Bank of England forecast, shows household disposable incomes are set to fall by 2% in 2022. That's a larger drop than after the global financial crisis and the largest drop since at least 1949. It works out at around £1,000 per year per household. So what was the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey's solution?
What we can do is try to prevent inflation becoming more ingrained in the system.
You're trying to get into people's heads and ask them not to ask for too high pay rises.
Well, broadly, yes. I will say that in the sense of saying we do need to see moderation of wage rises. Now, that's painful. I don't want to, in any sense, sugar that message. It is painful. But we need to see that in order to get through this problem more quickly.
So while the value of the money in your pocket goes down, whatever you do, don't ask for a pay rise so that you can afford the same amount of things as you did before inflation increased. And this is all from a man paid £575,000 a year. It might not be painful for him. It's hard to imagine a more tone-deaf comment. Let them eat cake, I think, is sort of on a similar level to that one. Bailey's argument, put simply, is that the way to control inflation is to stop people spending. And you can do that in two ways: raise interest rates so that borrowing is more expensive, or control incomes so that people have less to spend. But is that the only way to rein in inflation? On Twitter, the Financial Times European economics commentator Martin Sandbu asked, genuine question, why does the Governor of the Bank of England encourage restraint in wage demands but not call for restraint in businesses' attempts to protect their profit margins? Intellectual bias, ideology, greater resignation with reference to price than wage setting, or something else? That is a very good question. Why is it that workers are told to forego pay rises to protect their incomes, but bosses aren't told to forego increasing prices to protect their profits? I spoke earlier today to James Meadway.
Rishi Sunak made very clear that his priority is protecting profits, and maybe he'll throw, almost literally crumbs at a few people in terms of support. But in the end, it's about these. We must protect the profits that are being made by some companies, very, very large energy companies, out of the current spike in gas prices, and everything else, including government's own tax revenue, is very much not a priority. So that's partly why it's happening there. Some of it is a sort of ideological problem or a confusion, I think, in some economists' head when you look at what Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, was saying. Yeah, in his head is the idea that we're getting inflation because wages are going up. And if you look at what's happened to wages the last 10 years, real wages have fallen in Britain for most people. If you look at what's happening right now, their real wages, the amount that you can actually buy with the money you get, is dropping. So people are getting worse off because of inflation. And he's turning around and saying, oh, well, this is kind of like the 1970s or something where, wages go up and this is putting prices up. Prices are going up right now, in particular, because the international price of gas has gone up. If you take a pay cut, if you sort of say, oh, well, I won't ask for more money this year, that won't make any difference to the amount that you're paying for Russian gas or gas from anywhere else in the world. It's completely nonsensical to do this. So it's quite heavily ideological, and it also reflects the real balance of opinion, the real ideals of the government that we've got, which in the end is to protect profits, to keep the system as it is, working in the interests of people right at the top of society. And it's not about looking after the great majority.
And what is the correct policy response here? I suppose what Martin Sandbu is suggesting is that instead of calling for pay restraint for workers, you could call for price restraint for bosses. You could say, could you keep your prices down, even if to maintain your profit margins, you need to raise them? Should we be calling for price controls or telling businesses they can't raise prices in order to control inflation?
Yes, we should. On at least some products, some things that we're paying for. that there's a kind of weird inflation at the minute that it's driven really, really strongly by actually quite a limited number of different things we buy. So gas is a really obvious one. Gas has shot up in price over the last 12 months or so. So capping that price that people have to pay on their gas bills makes sense. And this is what's happened in France. This is what's happened right the way across Europe. Portugal is capping domestic energy prices. Norway has introduced a system where the government actually pays like 80% of your bill. Other countries are doing this. And it's a cost for government, but you put that cost onto the profiteers. So that's the companies making really huge profits. Shell, $14 billion in the last year, for example. You dump the costs on them and you say they can take the hit and everybody else is protected. And that's price control on gas. More generally, what you want to see happen is exactly as Martin Sambou says, which is that, look, if you want to deal with inflation, we need to pay people more. We've had a decade now of falling real wages, just about, for most people. So what we really want to happen is if prices are going up, people should be paid more to cope with that. And that means redistribution. That means, in effect, you're going to take some money from people right at the top of society and distribute it to everyone else. So it's the exact opposite of what Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England governor, was saying, that we don't want wages to be suppressed because it's not going to do anything about inflation. It's not making the blindest bit of difference to the price of coffee that we're buying from Brazil or gas that you're getting from Qatar or Russia or wherever it might be. It doesn't make the blindest bit of difference to that price. What we need is a big increase in wages for people who are working in Britain right now and control on some prices, including, for example, the price of gas.
How many things are we controlling the prices of? Is it just sort of 5 big commodities, or is it going to have to be something more extensive than that?
I don't think it has to be. I don't think it's really feasible to start saying, okay, we're going to control every single price out there. You can get a sort of fantasy where government is able to do this. But if there's something that's so crucial to people's living standards, like how much you're paying for it, energy, how much you're paying to heat your house in the middle of winter, then it makes sense to say we're going to control that because this is something that's actually socially obviously quite a big gain to do. And by the way, it's a side argument, but you can see this argument starting to bubble up in kind of academic economics now. Is it a good idea to control some prices? Does it have a positive impact on the distribution of wealth in society? And the answer is basically yes. I mean, clearly it does. You end up ideally taking money away from extremely wealthy people who run Shell and making sure other people have more money in their pocket. So I don't think you need a general system of price controls. The actual way you want to deal with this, in the medium term at least, is a big old pay rise for everyone of the kind that Boris Johnson promised. I mean, he's still Prime Minister. Presumably the promise still holds. He's absolutely right. Everyone in Britain, the poorest 90%, let's say, certainly those right at the poorer end of the income distribution should be getting a big fat pay increase right now to deal with these price increases. That's the quickest, most effective way to deal with the kind of inflation we have. And all this nonsense, basically ideological, saying that, it's wage increases that are driving price rises now. Absolutely, absolutely rubbish. It's very clear what needs to happen. And the government, if it cared about what happened to most people in Britain, it would be doing something like this straight away. Big increase in the minimum wage, control the price of gas. 2 obvious things to do.
We've been talking about a statement from the governor of the Bank of England. Obviously, he also has a pretty powerful role and material power over the economy. The Bank of England have just increased interest rates. Do you think that the attitude which is summed up in that statement from him is directing government policy? And does that mean that even if, people don't want to accept lower wages, we're going to be forced to?
The steer from government is to try and squash wage growth. Now, this has been made, there's a leaked document from the Treasury just before Christmas, where it talks about the need to restrain wage growth in the public sector so as to discipline the private sector. So in other words, I paraphrase slightly, but in other words, you hold back wage growth in the public sector, which government can control. And if you notice the last 10 years of austerity, government has always tried to restrain wage growth in the public sector. And by making people paid less effectively in real terms in the public sector, you're going to try and undermine wage growth in the private sector as well. So there is a general steer, not just from the Bank of England and what its government's just said, but also from government to say, look, we're going to try and restrain wages over this period. Now, this clashes somewhat with what Boris Johnson was saying just a few months ago, and there's a tension, I think, inside what this government is trying to do. But it also says to me that there's going to be a real fight over this. Like, we have certainly not seen at all the last of the crisis around the price of gas, around price rises in general. All the forecasts say prices are going to continue rising at a really quite high rate for at least the first part of this year. And my own view is that the rate of inflation may come down a bit, but it's going to stay high. So we're going to have all of these issues not going away, not now, not anytime soon. And that means there's going to be a real fight over people's living standards and the amount of money they get in the pay packet. And that is really where union organisation comes in. It's essential that we now build unions absolutely everywhere, particularly in the private sector, where they're actually very weak in this country. And we start to fight for pay increases. And people need to cut through this layers of rubbish that we're going to start getting about how pay rises are contributing to inflation. Absolutely, absolutely wrong. The inflation we have now is driven by really big international factors. The crisis in the supply of gas, in the supply of food, in extreme weather, knocking out semiconductor production in Taiwan, this sort of thing. It's got nothing to do with how much people are getting paid in Britain right now.